On a winter day in 1980, in a prison in Soviet Belarus, a man was taken from his cell and shot. He had been convicted of murder. A young woman found dead near a road in the Vitebsk region, one of a long line of women found that way, on the verges and field tracks of the quiet north of the Republic. The chief witness against him was the woman he shared his life with. He had denied everything, in the cells, in the courtroom, to the end. The sentence was death, and in the Soviet Union, a death sentence was not a metaphor. The file was stamped closed. Closing files was what the system did best. For 9 years, women had been dying along the roads of this region, and each death had received its own file, its own investigator, and, sooner or later, its own culprit, because the investigators of Soviet Belarus did not leave cases unsolved. The man shot that winter was simply one of the ways the machine won. The region could breathe. The matter was, in every official sense, finished. And then, out on the grey roads between Vitebsk and Polotsk, where the buses run half empty after dark, it began again. This is the story of 14 years of murders in a state that did not allow them to be named. It is the story of the people who answered for those murders, one after another, while the man they answered for watched. And it is the story of where that man was standing while 500,000 pages of handwriting were read in the hunt for him. A place so close to the hunters that nobody thought to look at it. This is Eastern Files. The Vitebsk region sits in the north of Belarus, along the river Dvina. Flat, forested, scattered country, small towns and smaller villages threaded together by bus routes. Vitebsk itself is an old river city of factories and technical schools. Polotsk, upstream, is older still, and beside Polotsk stands Novopolotsk, which in 1971 was barely a town at all, an oil city raised out of nothing in the boom years to refined Soviet crude, full of young workers and dormitories. Between these cities and around them runs the geography this story is made of. Highways, field roads, bus stops. Life here moved on foot and by bus, and the buses stopped early. A shop assistant coming home from the evening shift, a student from a technical school, a woman who had missed the last connection and started walking toward her village. The roads carried them every evening, in every season. The war had burned through this republic a generation earlier, and what it rebuilt was proud of its order, its quiet, its certainties. One of the certainties was that the women who set out for home arrived there. In May of 1971, that stopped being true. "14 years later, a man would sit across a table from his interrogators and tell them about that night in May. He was 24 then, and he was walking the dark road home because the last bus had gone. He was carrying a rope. He meant, he said, to hang himself. The girl he loved had written to him while he served in the army to tell him she was marrying another man, and he had carried that letter inside himself ever since, the way other men carry shrapnel. Somewhere on that road, in the dark, he met a 19-year-old woman walking alone. What he told his interrogators he thought in that moment is in the record, and it is one of the coldest sentences in the file. "Why should I choke myself over a woman?" he said. "Better I strangle one myself." The rope he had brought for his own neck went around hers. He hid her body and he walked home, and nobody looked at him twice, not that night and not for 14 years afterward. In October of that year, he attacked again, near a factory on the edge of Vitebsk, and this time the road was not empty. School children came down the path with a flashlight, voices carrying in the dark, and he let go of the woman and ran. She lived. She is the only person known to have survived him. She went to the militia, and the militia decided the matter was not serious enough to register. And by the account he later gave, before that same night was out, he had followed another woman from a bus stop and killed her. 2 women dead, 1 survivor, 1 report turned away. The year was 1971, and the system had already shown, in miniature, everything it was going to do. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what was allowed to exist. In the Soviet Union of those years, the serial killer was officially a foreign species, a symptom of capitalist decay, a creature of the West like unemployment. A socialist society, by definition, could not produce such a thing, and what cannot exist cannot be hunted. So when women began to be found assaulted and strangled along the roads of the Vitebsk region, the deaths were not gathered into one investigation. Each was its own case. Each case required its own solution, and each solution required a culprit. Supplying culprits was the specialty of the senior investigator of the Republic's procuracy, a decorated veteran named Mikhail Javnerovich, who had been closing cases since 1944 and whom admirers called the Belarusian Maigret, after the great fictional detective. His legend rested on a single number, 100%. Every case he took, he solved. No detective on earth has ever been that good, but the legend was never about being good. The reviews that later tore his files apart described the method. A suspect picked up over some trifle, hooliganism, a theft, a quarrel, days of pressure and beatings in the cells, and at the end of them, a confession, written out the way the file needed it written. The machine had targets to meet, and it did not especially care whom it fed on. What it cared about was the number. A solved case was a solved case, and the man who confessed to it was guilty by definition, because this justice rested on the confession the way a church rests on its altar. Hold that thought through everything that follows. Every wrong man in this story signed, or was signed for. The system never once had to prove anything. It only had to make someone say yes. Through 1972 and 1973, the killings went on, scattered along the roads, filed apart, solved apart. And in 1974, in Polotsk, the machine delivered its first great answer. 3 local men, Nikolai Yanchenko, Valery Kovalyov, and Vladimir Pashkovich, stood trial for 3 of the murders. The case had been built in the house style. A witness had seen 3 men with a dog somewhere near one of the scenes. That was the seed. The pressure rooms did the rest. The evidence against them included an exhibit that deserves to be remembered wherever justice is taught. It was a photograph of a puppy. A small dog photographed and entered into the case file over the caption, "A dog of the German Shepherd type." That page stood in the file in the place where proof was supposed to stand. The commissions that later took the case apart found the other kind of page too. A complaint preserved with its date, the 23rd of April 1974, naming an inspector called Fomin and the beating one of the men could not make anyone hear about. Kovalyov was sentenced to 15 years. Pashkovich to 12, Yanchenko to 2.5. While the 3 men sat in the dock in Polotsk, something happened out on the roads. Or rather, nothing did. For the whole of 1974, not one woman was killed. If anyone in the procuracy wanted proof that the right men had been caught, the calendar itself seemed to offer it. General Mieczyslaw Grzyb, who would one day command the hunt for the real killer, says the explanation was sitting in the public gallery. The man the murders belonged to had come to Polotsk to watch the trial. The killings had stopped because the killer was attending court. When the trial ended, the quiet ended with it. Five years later, the machine produced the verdict this film began with. In 1979, investigators working one of the roadside murders picked up a man named Nikolai Terenya, a drifter with a record, the kind of man files love. He had come to their attention over a theft. Somewhere in the pressure rooms, the theft became the murder. And with him, they took the woman he lived with, Lyudmila Kadushkina, because the case needed a witness, and a common law wife describing her man's crime is the kind of witness no court of that era would question. Terenya never confessed. It is worth saying plainly, because almost everyone else in this story was made to. Not in the cells, not at the trial, not at the end. It did not matter. The testimony had been obtained, the court accepted it, and the sentence was death. On a winter day in 1980, he was taken from his cell and shot. The man executed at the start of this film, the closed file, the system's victory. His name was Nikolai Terenya. He was guilty of nothing except being convenient, and the state killed him for it. And the machine was not finished with that household. Lyudmila Kadushkina, the witness it had manufactured, was herself convicted for her part in the affair and sent away to the camps. Sit with that for a moment. The state composed her testimony, forced her to speak it, used it to shoot her husband, and then imprisoned her for having taken part in the crime it had invented. The ledger of the innocent was still open. There was room left in it. The ledger kept filling for years. In January 1984, a 20-year-old woman named Tatiana Katsuba was murdered, and the case fell on a young man named Oleg Adamov. What was done to him went beyond even the house style. He was sent to the Novinky psychiatric hospital outside Minsk and held through a month of injections. And when the chemistry alone did not break him, a prosecutor named Valery Soroko forged the forensic report that sealed the case. Adamov tried to take his own life in custody. He lived, and he was sentenced to 15 years. Vladimir Gorelov was sentenced to 12 years for another of the murders. 6 years in, his eyes failed him, and the state released a blind man back into the world it had taken him from. Others followed, and their names deserve at least the dignity of being said aloud. Lushkovsky, Mushinsky, Matskevich, Oriol, Blinov. Some of them confessed after the methods had done their work. Not all of them did. It made no difference either way. And that may be the most frightening fact in this film. Confession or no confession, the machine convicted whomever it had decided to convict. Count it all together, and the number is this: 14 innocent people convicted of murders they did not commit. 13 men and 1 woman, the woman being Lyudmila Kadushkina, punished for testimony the state itself had written. 1 of the 14 was shot. 1 went blind in the camps. 1 was broken in a psychiatric ward. And through all of it, year after year, closed file after closed file, the other ledger, the one nobody was keeping, kept growing too. Out on the roads, the women were still dying. Because all those years, the man the files were really about was living in plain sight, and nothing in his life said otherwise. He was a mechanic, and a good one, the head of the machine repair workshop at his collective farm. He was married with 2 children, and investigators would later notice that he had named his daughter Lena, after the girl whose letter he had once carried a rope down a dark road over. Neighbors respected him. Colleagues respected him. He did not drink away his wages, and he did not raise his hand at home. In the entire catalogue of things Soviet society knew how to be suspicious of, there was nothing to find. In 1981, he bought a car, a Zaporozhets, the small, loud, cheap car of the Soviet everyman. His was red. With it, the murders found their final form. He offered rides at bus stops along the roads between Vitebsk, Polotsk, and Novopolotsk in the hours when the buses thin out and a lift home is a small mercy. A respectable man, a family car, a polite offer. The women who got in had done nothing careless. Everything in their world said this was safe, and their world was wrong. The killings accelerated through 1984 and 1985, the worst years of all. At the end of August 1984, he killed 2 women in a single day, on the road toward Beshenkovichi, west of Vitebsk. The deaths were handled the way everything in this story was handled. Quietly. No newspaper printed a word about them. Almost nobody in the Republic knew they had happened at all. Remember that silence. The whole case is about to turn on it. By the beginning of 1985, the arithmetic had become impossible to file away. In January, the Republic created something the doctrine said should never be needed: a unified operative group, run from Minsk under a militia general named Mstislav Grib, to look at the Vitebsk deaths as one thing. Looking at them as one thing was itself the revolution. An investigator named Nikolai Ignatovich had spent years rereading the scattered files and arguing to anyone who would risk listening that the bodies by the Vitebsk roads were the work of a single man. There is a word for what he was describing, and in the Soviet Union of 1985, that word was still close to unsayable. Saying it had been, for years, a good way to end a career. None of this reached the public. There were no warnings in the papers, no descriptions, no appeals for witnesses. The women of the region were never once told, in print, that the roads were killing them. The state hunted the way it ruled, in silence, and so the hunt had to be built entirely out of its own people. The KGB came into the case. Witnesses had described again and again a small red car near the places where women vanished, and so the region's red Zaporozhets cars were catalogued, owner by owner. Checkpoints went up on the highways. Militiamen in the winter dark, and beside them the volunteer order patrols, the system called the Druzhina. Trusted citizens with red armbands, stopping cars, checking documents, the eyes of the state multiplied by its believers. The hunt was enormous, and it caught nothing. Months of roadblocks, thousands of drivers checked, and the man with the red car kept killing. Whoever he was, he seemed to know exactly which roads were watched, and when, and what the militia thought it was looking for. Inside the operative group, that pattern had a chilling reading, and almost nobody dared to say that one out loud either. In the middle of August 1985, a letter arrived at the regional newspaper, the Vitebsk Worker, addressed to its acting editor, a man named Romanovsky. It was semi-literate, angry, and strange. It announced that the women dying along the roads were not victims but sentences, executions carried out on wives and girlfriends who had betrayed their men. It made threats and it made demands. And it was signed in the name of an organization nobody had ever heard of, because it did not exist, the Patriots of Vitebsk. It might have gone into the drawer where newspapers keep their madmen, except for one thing. The letter boasted about the double murder on the Beshenkovici Road. The two women killed in one day in August 1984. The case that had never been printed anywhere, that almost nobody in the Republic knew had happened. A madman can claim any murder he has read about. He cannot claim one that was never published. Whoever wrote this letter was not borrowing the killings from the press because the press had nothing to borrow. He owned them. For the first time in 14 years, the killer had volunteered a piece of himself, a page of his own handwriting. People who later reconstructed the investigation say the letter then spent weeks locked in a safe while the agencies argued over what it meant, and that while it lay there, 2 more women died. What ended the argument was the morning of the 27th of October 1985, when the last victim was found, and with her the detail this case has never been able to forget. Folded into her mouth was a note in the same semi-literate hand. For treason, death, it read. The Patriots of Vitebsk. He was no longer writing to the newspaper. He was leaving his signature on the dead. A killer who writes has given the state a fingerprint, and the state decided to take everyone's. What followed was one of the largest handwriting operations ever mounted anywhere. The script of an entire region collected and read, 300,000 passport application forms, 80,000 receipts, 70,000 newspaper subscription slips, 20,000 letters of complaint to the authorities, more than 500,000 samples of ordinary Soviet paper, hauled out of archives and offices and read line by a team of some 30 handwriting experts, hunting for the hand behind the Patriots of Vitebsk. On the 25th of November 1985, the sweep reached a stack of papers gathered by a district inspector named Veretennikov. Routine explanatory notes, a few lines accounting for yourself to the militia, collected from the owners of red Zaporozhets cars. One note in the stack was wrong. The hand that wrote it kept changing its mind, the slant rebuilt, the letters reshaped, a man writing in a costume. Whoever he was, when a village inspector had asked him for a harmless paragraph, he had understood exactly what the paragraph was for, and he had tried to write it in someone else's hand. It did not save him. An expert named Tatyana Yerofeyeva set the disguised note beside the Patriot's letter and read straight through the costume to the writer, the way you can know a voice on a bad telephone line. And the note had a name attached because the form required one. It belonged to a 38-year-old mechanic from the Vitebsk countryside, the respected head of a collective farm repair workshop, a married father of 2. His name was Gennady Mikasevich. They took him in December 1985. The men who made the arrest remembered finding him at a relative's house, his family around him, and the suitcases already packed. Tickets south to Odessa. He denied everything, and witnesses recall him telling his wife it was a mistake, that he would be home soon. Then the searchers began turning up what 14 years of separate files had never managed to connect. Things that had belonged to dead women. Investigators say one victim's gold ring had been melted down years before into a dental crown for his wife, who knew nothing and had suspected nothing about the man whose house she kept. When the belongings surfaced, the denials stopped and Gennady Mikasevich began to talk. And as he talked, the investigators understood whom they had been hunting, and the case turned from a tragedy into something there is no tidy word for. Mikasevich was a družinik, a member of the volunteer patrols that helped the militia keep order, and not a rank-and-file one. The commander of his local squad. He wore the red armband. At the checkpoints thrown up across the region to catch the Vitebsk killer, he had stood beside the militia in the winter dark, stopping cars and checking driver's documents, searching with the full authority of the state for himself. It went further back than the checkpoints. General Grib says that during the 1974 trial in Polotsk, the man whose murders were being judged sat quietly in the public gallery and watched 3 innocent men answer for him. The patrols heard militia talk, and so, for years, he had known roughly what the hunt knew. Which roads were watched, which cars were wanted, when to stop, and when it was safe to begin again. The state had built its search out of trusted men. He was a trusted man. That was the whole of his disguise, and it had worked for 14 years. Through the winter, he led them to the dead. Convoy after convoy went out to the roadsides while he pointed out the places. 37 crime scenes reconstructed in all. The prisoner cuffed to a convoy officer by a tether welded shut for safety. He remembered everything. The years, the seasons, the small details of women whose files had long been closed around other people. He confessed in the end to 43 murders, more than the investigation had ever connected. General Grib has shown television crews what became of that welded handcuff. It was found, years later, eaten through with rust. Corroded, the general says, by what came off the man's skin during those drives, by his fear. The trial opened in Minsk in 1987, and its very form was an admission of scale. Not a Belarusian court, but a collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR itself, sitting in Minsk because the case had outgrown the Republic. People who were at the courthouse say he was guarded there by the KGB, and that the KGB's concern was not the public. It was guarding him from the police, the men whose careers and convictions his confessions were taking down. The numbers told the same story in layers. He had confessed to 43 murders. The investigation stood behind some 36. The court proved 33, and his own prosecutor suspected the true count was higher than all of it. From custody, investigators recall, he explained himself without much drama. "If I had stayed free," he said, "I would have continued. It is an inseparable part of me." The sentence was death. He was shot at Pishilarsky prison in Minsk in the autumn of 1987, and the state handled his death the way it had handled his crimes, in silence. The news agency announced the execution months afterward, the following February, in a dispatch a few lines long. Those who saw him last recall his final words: "I will go to my girls." Then it was the system's turn to answer, and here the story reaches its coldest flaw. Around 200 officials were sanctioned over the Vitebsk case, reprimanded, demoted, expelled, pensioned off, almost all of it along party lines. Paperwork, punishing paperwork. The investigator who had led the case against Nikolai Terenya took his own life. In the entire affair, exactly one official went to prison: Valery Sirocco, the prosecutor who had forged the report that broke Oleg Adamov. He served 4 years, and years later he published a book justifying himself. And the Belarusian Maigret. A criminal case was finally opened against Mikhail Javnerovich, the investigator whose 100% had been fed with broken people. It never reached a courtroom. In June 1987, the Soviet Union declared an amnesty to mark the 70th anniversary of the revolution, and Javnerovich, a decorated war invalid, qualified. The case was extinguished. He was expelled from the party. He kept his rank, his pension, and his medals, and he died before the year was out. It was not even the first time. In 1981, in the town of Mosya, the same investigator had put 6 innocent men in prison for a single murder. They were freed 2 years later, and nothing changed, and nobody made him stop. The Vitebsk case was not one bad file. It was the system working as designed. The 14 were rehabilitated, one after another, the living and the dead. Nikolai Terenya's rehabilitation arrived years after the state had shot him. A piece of paper recording that he had been innocent all along, addressed to a man who no longer existed. The living received certificates too, and compensation. Valery Kovalyov, one of the 3 men convicted over the photograph of a dog, was sentenced to 15 years and served 12. And he has told interviewers what the state's arithmetic of apology came to. 3,700 rubles, from which the accountants deducted the tax the Soviet Union charged its childless men. He had no children. He had spent the years a man has children in a labor camp. For a murder, another man would one day describe to investigators from memory. Kovalyov still lives in Vitebsk, an old man now, one of the last people who carry this story in the first person. The men who broke the case rose with the new country. Nikolai Ignatovich, the investigator who had spent years saying the forbidden word, became, when the Soviet Union ended, the first prosecutor general of independent Belarus. He did not live long in the office, and he left the case its epitaph. Asked what the Vitebsk affair had really shown, he answered, "We did not remove the tumor." Mstislav Grib, the general who ran the hunt, went on to lead the state itself for a time in the 90s, and his signature sits under the first constitution of independent Belarus. In his memoirs, Grib set down what he believed the case had been made of: corruption, and the merciless demand that investigators solve every case at any cost. And he recorded one more detail, the right one to end the accounting on. The men who actually caught Gennady Mikasevich fell into disfavor, he wrote. There were no decorations for them. The medals stayed where they had always been, with the investigator whose 100% had filled a ledger with innocent names, in his grave under an amnesty. One more thing outlived everyone. Pishchalowski prison, where Mikasevich was shot, did not retire with the Soviet Union. Belarus remained the last country in Europe still carrying out executions, and for another generation, the sentences were carried out behind those same walls until 2024. As for the case, it survives in its relics. A photograph of a puppy that stood where evidence should have stood, a letter in a costumed hand, a handcuff eaten through by rust, and a red armband, the kind issued to the men a state believes it can trust. If cases like this one belong in your evenings, the file's history closed without ever quite answering for, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It is the simplest way to keep these films coming, and it genuinely helps. And tell us in the comments where you land on the question this case leaves behind. 14 innocent people were convicted for one man's murders. One of them was shot. And the killer stood at the roadblocks in a red armband, searching for himself. Which failure do you find harder to forgive? The murderer the system refused to believe in, or the innocence it manufactured because believing was harder? We read everything. Until the next case, thank you for watching Eastern Files.